Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Paul Sullins. Welcome, Father.
Hello, Colleen. Pleased to be with you today.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show. And you work for the Ruth Institute, correct? Is that the right organization?
That is correct. I'm actually still an active professor of sociology at Catholic University, but I'm a research professor. I don't teach in the classroom anymore. I just write and do research. From an
Okay.
academic standpoint, I'm living the dream. And then I'm the senior research associate at the Ruth Institute, so I have a connection with them as well.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I knew you'd been at CUA, but I also heard you were connected with the Ruth Institute, so I wasn't sure which one to say you belong to.
Both of them. The Ruth Institute is probably the more important connection for what we're doing this afternoon.
Yeah. And today we're going to be talking about conversion therapy, or I believe there's a better term for it, which we'll get into. So there's a lot of misconceptions about this idea in today's society. So I think we'll just dive into what people actually, like what people think about it and what it actually
Mhm.
is. And I think that'd be a good place to start is
Sure.
what is conversion therapy and what's a better term for it?
Sure. So, conversion therapy is kind of a pejorative label for any therapeutic session or intervention or any effort really to help a person change their same sex attractions in the direction of opposite sex attractions, or at least to manage them in some way, shape, or form. Um, and so, in the academic literature, a better term is an acronym SOCE, which stands for Sexual Orientation Change Efforts. That's a blanket term for a wide variety of types of therapeutic um, strategies and techniques, all of which, in some way or other, are open to a person changing their sexual orientation or some aspect of sexual orientation. Now, when we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about three dimensions of a person's being and behavior, and that would be who they are attracted to. So whether they're attracted to persons of the same sex or opposite sex, uh, who they actually have sex with persons of the same sex or the opposite sex, and then the third dimension would be what they call themselves. Do they identify as homosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, or any of about 15 to 20 other possibilities, binary, queer, two spirited, all kinds of things that people conceive themselves to be. So you're not talking, when you talk about sexual orientation, you're not talking about a clear and distinct condition or notion. Those three dimensions that I talked about don't overlap. Only 26% of the time do all three overlap. So you have people who call themselves heterosexual but only have sex with persons of the same sex, or people who call themselves homosexual and only have sex with people of the opposite sex and say that they're not even attracted to people of the same sex, and so on and so forth. And so, in this kind of vibrant mix of understandings, you can see people um, attempting to find some understanding of themselves or definition of themselves. Often, young people who go through a period of exploration, confusion. Am I gay or am I not gay? Not sure. I mostly like girls, speaking for a guy. But there's that guy, he's pretty attractive. So does that make me gay? And so they have a lot of questions. SOCE therapists more or less help people deal with those questions and come to some resolution of them.
So would that be like talk therapy or something else? Because I think I've heard people refer to soci or not soci, but conversion therapy as torture.
Right.
And so I guess there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So what exactly are you talking about here? And are there any like negative bad forms of it that people should be aware of and not to mix them up?
Right. Uh, well, opponents of SOCE want to ban it, want to end the practice entirely, and they do that by um, associating or um, making it sound as if it's a terrible thing. They raise boogeymen with regard to SOCE, and one of them they raise is, as you mentioned, torture. And so we have two sources for understanding that maybe torture. One is some um, um, anecdotes of persons who've been through SOCE, and they have these scary stories that they tell of things that happened to them. And some of those things sound like torture. A lot of those persons, the stories, if they're investigated, don't hold up. They either are exaggerating what happened to them, or they're talking about something that happened many, many years ago, which I'll expand on in a minute. The other source is a report that's been promoted by the United Nations by an anti-torture group that is also very much opposed to SOCE on ideological grounds. And so they published a report that said SOCE is torture. But if you read the report, as I have done, um, you find that there's no specific instance of torture that they talk about. And they consider talk therapy a form of torture in certain instances. They consider EMDR, which is a standard therapeutic technique, also to be torture. They don't make a specific allegation. And so I've criticized this report and asked them, okay, if it's torture, who exactly is committing torture, and who are the victims? And they haven't been able to name one therapist in the United States that is actually committing torture. So they're not bringing uh, typical juridical charges. They're just trying to tar SOCE in this negative way. And another way that it gets tarred is that opponents of SOCE claim that it uses coercive and aversive techniques, things that harm people in the course of therapy. And what they're talking about is standard therapies that were done back in the 1950s through the 1970s. At that time, the primary uh, field or theoretical idea in psychology was called behaviorism. And behaviorism taught that you could change human behavior by rewards and punishments, much like training a horse or training a dog. And so, behaviorist therapists would indeed cause pain. They would use minor electric shocks to pain people so that they would have different ways of thinking. And mostly they did this for depression or for psychosis of various sorts. But some of them also did it for homosexuality. And for drug addiction, it was a common technique to put young people into boot camp type environments where it's very strict, and they were punished if they had anything to do with drugs to try to scare them out of this. Well, that was a whole set of techniques which has been discontinued today. It didn't work very well. And all of those have been stopped and not used for probably 30 years or more. But you still have people who are of an age and say, well, I underwent this kind of therapy when I was younger, and it was harsh and it was punitive. Well, that could very well be the case, but nobody for homosexuality or anything else does that kind of therapy today. The therapy today is all uh, benign talk therapy, just like we're talking here, and the therapist brings up ideas that people need to face and people need to consider.
So basically, it sounds like the problem is more of the way that therapy in general was conducted back in the 50s and 70s
Mhm.
versus how it's conducted now. And it's not specifically therapy that targets people struggling with same sex attraction.
That's right.
So so I'm guessing that the reason that a lot of people are against conversion therapy is because they don't want to admit the fact that people who experience same-sex attraction can in some way like quote unquote recover from that or experience a lessening of it. Is that because it challenges their ideologies? Is that the main
That's
reasoning behind
That's
this?
the whole reason behind it. The linchpin of the gay ideology is the notion that people are born gay and cannot change. It's immutable.
Mhm.
And therefore, being attracted to persons of the same sex is who you are. And you hear them say that a lot. Well, I
Mhm.
discovered who I am, or I can't deny who I am. Or this law is trying to punish me for being who I am. So for them, it's a matter of identity, um, and it's identity because they were born that way, and they can't change. And they have analogies to race, just like a person is born of a particular race and cannot change. So they say they're born gay and cannot change. So if you have even one person who is able to successfully change their sexual orientation, it undermines that whole idea. And we don't have not just one person, we have thousands of persons that have been able to change sexual orientation and been helped. My latest estimate using data from the gay activists is that there are about 150,000 persons in the United States who have transitioned from some level of same sex orientation to primarily or mostly heterosexual orientation via SOCE. Uh, the the success rate in sociotherapy, there have been about a half a dozen studies that have looked at this. I've performed one of them. And most studies find that most persons who attempt to change sexual orientation by means of therapy do not succeed in completely transitioning from homosexual to heterosexual. Um, about 15 to 20% do achieve that. So there is a small rate of what I would call full remission of homosexuality. And then about another 50% achieve some partial change. So if you think in terms of the Kinsey scale, which ranges persons from completely homosexual as a 7 to completely heterosexual as 0, and then other gradations are in between. You know, you're mostly heterosexual, so you'd be a little off of that one, and you're mostly homosexual, so you'd be a little off, and then bisexual would be right in the middle. On that scale, persons, about half of persons that undergo SOCE can move 1 or 2 points toward heterosexuality. Uh, Most people who go to SOCE um, are motivated by other things in their lives that are more important than who they're attracted to for sexual relations. For example, their religious convictions. So if they're strongly Catholic, strongly Mormon, strongly Muslim, and you believe that that's a obligation before God to marry and bear children, then they're highly motivated to try to change sexual orientation to the point that they can function in a heterosexual relationship. Another reason is that they're married. And they're married in a happy heterosexual marriage that they want to make work, and so they want to work on that. There are other reasons, but all of the people who undergo SOCE to change their sexual orientation challenge the ontological idea that who they're attracted to sexually is who they are somehow. All of them believe that who they are is something else, that they're a child of God that's created with different um, inclinations, or that they are um, constituted by what they believe and what they think, and not by who they may have sexual attraction to. And so that is what is really disturbing to the gay ideology. Um, and they're very clear about this even in the scientific literature. They believe that SOCE is wrong, even if it's successful, because it's unethical to try to change someone's sexual orientation. They will say uh, homosexual orientation is not a disease. It's a normal variation of human sexuality. And so it's unethical to try to cure something or fix something that's not broken, that's not a disease. And my response to that is twofold. One, a therapist should never try to impose their own views on the client. Um, and sociotherapists repeat over and over again, but the activists don't seem to listen. So we're not trying to cure people of anything. What we're trying to do is to help people who come to us who are disturbed by this conflict in their life. They have these attractions, which are very strong, but they also have a fundamental commitment to an identity that says they can't act on these attractions. And so we try to help them with that. And the client will bring the goal of wanting to change sexual orientation. The therapist does not impose that. Um, so, yeah.
I think you just touched on it then. My next question was going to be, how does SOCE differ from brainwashing?
Uh,
And I think that's a little bit of what you're saying. So can you go into that a little bit more of, is it basically just helping them talk through
mhm.
the attractions that they have and what is like the root cause of that? Is that basically what people are doing in SOCE?
Yeah, most sociotherapists will say our goal is not to change sexual orientation, but it's to help a person to live their life more fully and more authentically, whatever that may involve. Um, and the most typical case of sexual orientation, and I have to talk now only about males because we don't know that much about uh, the etiology of female sexual orientation. But for males, uh, attraction to persons of the same sex often arises out of two pathways. One is early sexual trauma. So they being sexually abused as a young person, or undergoing some other trauma related to sexuality, is often associated with attraction to persons of the same sex. I just looked at one study that found that men who were attracted to other men were over 6 times more likely to have been sexually abused as children. And so that that doesn't necessarily prove that that's the only cause or even a cause, but it is a condition, a risk factor for that. And so the therapist will deal with that trauma. And as the person comes to understand and be somewhat healed from that trauma, often these same sex attractions will diminish or even evaporate. I've heard some therapists say. The other thing that can be addressed in therapy has to do with the relationship to the parents in the early family life. So psychodynamic therapists, follow from Sigmund Freud and his theories, uh, look at the relationship of a child to his father and mother growing up, the Oedipal complex. And it is a common pattern for men who have attraction to other men that they had a very distant father and a very close mother. And there are different variations of this, but if let's say the family went through a divorce, divorce typically removes the father from an effective day-to-day relationship with the children, and so the father becomes very distant at that point. And if the mother is very protective or close emotionally to the child, then that could develop a same-sex attraction, and that can be dealt with through therapy, through kind of standard Freudian therapeutic techniques. So those are just two of the possibilities. Same-sex attraction for men and for women isn't necessarily just one thing. There may be a lot of different types of same-sex attraction um, and ways to become same-sex attracted. Another thing that's often not acknowledged or recognized is that almost everybody who has attraction to persons of the same sex also has some level of attraction to persons of the opposite sex. I talked earlier about the Kinsey scale going from 0 to 7. Well, very few people are at the 7 extreme. I think that's the one that's fully homosexual. Um, Very few people are there. The largest category is the one just below that, people who are mostly homosexual, which means they have some capacity to be attracted to persons of the opposite sex. Now, another fact that's pertinent here is if you look at children of same sex attracted folk, um,
Mhm.
the majority of them have conceived children with a partner of the opposite sex. 57% have a child. I just looked at census data. This is not some wild kind of investigation, but the census data looked at the number of sex partners of persons who were attracted to persons of the same sex, and came up with a very similar number. It was just below 60% report that they have had at least one heterosexual sexual experience. Well, what that tells us then is that it's not that people who are same sex attracted can't possibly function in a heterosexual relationship. And so the sociotherapist, for many of them, will help to expand or build on those heterosexual attractions that they already have and to diminish their need to depend on the homosexual attractions that they have.
Interesting. Okay, not that you would ever want to do this, but could it theoretically go the other direction where you could take someone who was heterosexual and wanted to be attracted to people of the same sex and use therapy to go the other direction too?
I think probably you could. I don't, as you say, I'm not aware of anyone who has um, articulated that. Um,
Yeah.
but there are persons who are same sex attracted who undergo therapy with sociotherapists who come out more committed to their homosexuality. And
Why
so
is
they come out more homosexual than they did before, a small proportion, excuse me. So in the study that I did in 2021 that looks at 125 men who had been through sociotherapy, um, as I said, 15 to 20% of them were able to become fully heterosexual in their functioning.
Mhm.
But 2 to 3% of them went the other way. Following the therapy, they were not as extremely homosexual as they did following the therapy. Now, why you're going to ask me why is that? And I have to tell you, as an empiricist, I don't know, but I have some thoughts, some speculations, and my speculation is that they probably are among the majority of persons who undergo SOCE who fail to achieve full heterosexual function. And at that point, they kind of gave up and they said, "Well, I guess I'm going to be homosexual. I may as well be the best LGBT person that I can be." And there have been some um, anecdotal reports of
Mhm.
persons making this statement. I tried my best to change and I couldn't, so I guess I'm just stuck. I'm going to be LGBT in that, or I don't know if I should use the word stuck, but they say, I may as well celebrate who I am and not uh, bother myself too much. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now here's another question. A lot of people claim that conversion therapy increases risk of suicide. And obviously, we're not using that term, but that's like the claim that people make. Does
Mhm.
SOCE increase people's risk of suicide?
No, it does not. Um, the
And why do people make that argument? And how do we know that it doesn't?
Well, again, it's another way to paste this horrible thing onto SOCE and have an argument for banning it. So there have been a number of studies that have attempted to show this. They have not been successful. In 2009, the American Psychological Association reviewed all of the research. It was um, motivated to do so by gay activist scholars in that organization. It's an extremely liberal, secular organization. Um,
Mhm.
and they uh, they concluded that there was not enough evidence to show that it was harmful to advocate banning it. There were a lot of studies that attempted to show it, but they had small samples and they were biased interviews with persons of their own opinions. There was no strong evidence that SOCE was harmful psychologically or that it promoted suicide. Now, since 2009, there have been about 40 studies that have attempted to provide better evidence of that. And the best of those studies was published in 2020. And it looked at a random population sample of LGBT persons in the United States, asked them whether they'd been to SOCE, asked them about their suicidal activity, um, and published a study saying that persons who had been to SOCE had twice as much lifetime suicidality. They were twice as likely to have thought about suicide and twice as likely to have attempted suicide. Well, I took a second look at that study, and in a study that I published 2 years later, showed that what they had done is they had taken, as they said, lifetime suicidal behavior. They didn't separate out the suicidal behavior that a person expressed before they went to this therapy from the suicidal behavior that they expressed after they went to this therapy. Now, that's a standard control that should be there for any um, study that alleges harm from an intervention. Obviously, if a person had thoughts of suicide and then later went to therapy, that therapy couldn't have caused their earlier thoughts of suicide. And most people
Mhm.
like you would nod your head to that and say, well, of course, that's just common sense. Well, to these researchers, they didn't think that was necessary at all. So I took that same data and I separated out the before and after suicidality. I found that for suicide ideation, for example,
Mhm.
65% of the ideation that persons expressed occurred before they went to the SOCE therapy, only 35% after they went to the therapy. And so if you make that simple adjustment to the data, you find that persons after going to SOCE were no more suicidal by any measure than the persons who had never been to such therapy. And for the most important suicidal behavior, which is a suicide attempt, going to SOCE dramatically reduced the risk of suicide attempts following SOCE. Persons who had been to SOCE were far less likely to subsequently attempt suicide than comparable persons of the same age who had never been to SOCE. So SOCE not only does not induce suicide risk, it helps to reduce suicide risk. So this is a beneficial form of therapy for persons who struggle with having same-sex attractions and want help. It provides them some help. It's not fully successful for everybody, but it does provide
Mhm.
for a large number of persons. Most people who go report that they get some psychological benefit from the therapy. They're less suicidal, they're less prone to depression, they're less prone to anxiety following this therapy than they were before. Um, and so that's the reality about this therapy.
Mhm.
It's not a panacea, it's not a cure all, but it certainly is not harmful.
Mhm. Could it also be that people that are seeking therapy have other traumas that they need to work through and
Mhm.
therefore are more at risk of suicide in
Oh,
general?
sure. Yeah. The LGBT population has much higher suicide risk. They're about 6 times more likely to attempt suicide than the rest of the population. Overall, the transgender population also is at risk
Mhm.
for a number of health problems and health interventions. Um,
And again, that's not coming necessarily from efforts to help them reduce the same-sex
no,
attraction. That's coming from just what everything that they're struggling with and potentially traumas in their childhood.
right. Well, it's a whole different session we would have to have on what it is that may cause uh, those risks. The LGBT activists will argue that it's due to social discrimination that they face
Mhm.
and stigma, and that if persons would accept LGBT people for who they are, if religions would stop teaching that it was a sin to engage in homosexual relations, then LGBT people would not have the level of trauma and struggle that they do. And so they blame the society for imposing or internalizing these problems upon the LGBT population. Um, and they believe that is 100% of the cause. If the society would become more accepting, or if religions would change their teachings,
Mhm.
that LGBT people would not face this level of psychological harm. And so there are studies in the scientific literature openly arguing that Christian religions and other world religions should stop teaching that LGBT people or that homosexuality is somehow less acceptable than heterosexuality, and certainly should stop teaching that it's a sin or it's not something that God has intended for the human race. So there is a battle between the faith and the secular ideology that is associated with the LGBT um, practice. Now, I'm not in favor of discrimination or stigma um, against persons of sexual minority, um, but um, I don't think there's any good evidence that this is the sole cause of the struggles that they have. There's good evidence, in my opinion, that there are lots of other factors, internal factors, that that also promote higher rates of psychopathology.
That seems like a very hard thing to prove too, because you would have to basically say that there's like that abuse as a child isn't a factor and that all these other things, like it seems hard to prove that 100% of these struggles would come from social and not from other factors in their
Yeah.
lives.
Now, so if you're talking about abuse as a child, what they
Mhm.
will tell you is that, well, this child was already beginning to show um, uh,
Mhm.
lesbian or gay attractions,
Mhm.
and so their behavior brought on the abuse, right? So they say so. Therefore, it's not it's not anything internal to them
Mhm.
that would cause this trauma or this stress. It's the fact that they were their parents or caregivers reacted negatively to them and abused them in some way. Yeah, so that's how they answer that. You would think, being abused as a child, they were innocent, and that might be a cause for things further down the line. So no, yeah.
Interesting. Do you know of which places where SOCE is banned? Because I know that some, like, I was looking at it
Mhm.
briefly while I was preparing for this, and it seemed like some countries had banned it, but I
Mhm.
wasn't sure about within the United States what's going on. So do you know what that situation
Uh,
is in
it,
general?
Last I checked, 20 states in the United States have some ban on SOCI, mostly for children, for youngsters. Um, and the number is changing because there are a lot of legislative efforts. So
Mhm.
you can go to a website. Several websites are out there that would tell you which states those are exactly. And then there are three states that have moved in the other direction. They have laws or legislative decisions that ban having a ban of SOCI. And so these are jurisdictions that have attempted to ban SOCI, and then the courts have struck that down, or it's been voted down in some fashion. There's also, of course, the phenomenon of gender um, identity. So there's
Mhm.
lots of efforts to transition young persons, and there are bans on that. And so there's a mix of those kind of efforts. Um, I in terms of countries that have banned it, I'm not aware of any other whole country that has banned it, but you're probably right that there are some. In England, it is uh, banned by the certifying organizations, not by the government. Although they've attempted to get the government to ban it, and they may succeed. The government is considering doing that. But right now, it would be the professional associations who say we're not going to certify any therapist who will engage in SOCI. In Australia, there are probably the strongest bans in the world in two or three of the states of Australia. Victoria and New South Wales have very extensive bans on SOCI to the point that if you just had a conversation almost casually with someone uh, and intimated that they could change their sexual orientation, that might be an actionable um, thing there. In fact, the ban in one of the Australian states explicitly bans religious leaders from praying for people with same sex attraction. Um, so there are bans all over. The problem with the bans in the United States is that they are drawn so broadly the wording is so broad that it could cover pastoral conversations. And so we have the Catholic apostolate Courage, which
Mhm.
deals with uh, attempts to minister to persons with same sex attractions. And they have raised some concern that should these bans be prosecuted, that a priest who is counseling a parishioner according to the teaching of the church could fall prey or fall afoul of one of these bans and could be punished for suggesting that uh, living in a sodomy relationship is not what God would want that person to do, and that they may need to try to change that or diminish that.
Wow. It's also just so interesting that you were saying most people who go to this form of therapy are looking for it for themselves. So
Mhm.
basically, these bans are taking away an
Right.
opportunity for people who are experiencing unwanted same sex
Mhm.
attraction. And also, if it does significantly decrease risk of suicide, it's taking away the ability to actually get the therapy they need to be able to hopefully reduce their risk of suicide.
It's telling people that speech that they choose to engage in, that they want, um, that they're not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to set the kind of goals in therapy that they want, and they're not allowed to have the kind of discussions that they want with
Mhm.
therapists.
Are these bans based on the studies that you were saying, like, seemed to show that it increased risk of suicide? Is that the logic behind
Mhm.
the statewide bans?
Yeah, a lot of these studies, I call them propaganda science. They're made
Mhm,
specifically to try to achieve a political outcome. And they're deployed in legislatures and in courts to try to disparage this kind of therapy and to eliminate it. The very idea that someone could change from uh, homosexual to heterosexual, even partially, uh, is to them an unethical, almost an unthinkable thought. I have had activists who say, well, SOCE therapists are trying to eradicate the gay population. They're trying to make them all disappear and go away. Uh, Even though only a minority ever achieve change, they feel like some level of threat from this.
interesting. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you for coming on and sharing all of the research you've done and all of your thoughts on
Thank
this.
you for your great questions, Colleen, and for this very interesting conversation for me as well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye bye.
And to all of our listeners, please like and subscribe, check out the new ebooks we have coming out, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.